So now we have Professor Milena Parent from the University of Ottawa, a manager. We need managers also, of course. We wrote a book together, we edited a book together recently on the sports events management. Milena has been involved in many Olympics. She was a seconded volunteer at the Vancouver 2010 Olympics and many other duties. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Merci Jean-Loup, merci Emmanuel de m'avoir invité. When I accepted to do this, I thought it would be an easy paper to write. And then I started digging, going, okay, how am I actually going to do this? And at the same time, I came across a quote from John Furlong, CEO of VANOC, who said, I look at our situation and think we are a very good model of how to do these events. This is, to me, very good for the Canada brand of being reliable, being trustworthy, keeping your promises, being on time and on budget, being responsible about the things that really matter to the public. So, I was reading this going, okay, what is this model that he's talking about? How do we actually do Olympic Games in Canada that seem to be so wonderful based on this quote? So, to understand the governance of the Olympic Games in Canada, Vancouver being our most recent Olympic Games, I actually decided to go back in time a little bit to Calgary. One of the reasons I didn't go to back to 76 is I technically was not born yet. But I did watch Calgary 88 on the television. I wanted to be Elizabeth Manley skating at the next Olympic Games. I ended up working at the Games in Vancouver instead of skating, but at least I was there. But what these two games allowed me to do was actually use a lot of the documents that were available, and they're comparable documents that I was able to build a benchmark with Calgary and then compare with Vancouver to build this so-called governance model of Olympic Games in Canada. Now, obviously, I'm probably preaching to the choir when I say that good governance has many different concepts associated with it. It's a very vague concept. And lofty goals, transparency, accountability, efficiency, consensus building, trust, participation. In theory, everything is great. Absolutely, this is what we want to do, and obviously these are also Western values and ideas. In practice, a little bit harder to implement, and how do you put all of this together? Now, Jean-Loup and Brenda came out with a book in 2008 suggesting 5 different principles for the Olympic Games themselves, the system of governance, including transparency, democracy, accountability, autonomy, and social responsibility, which we've heard a bit about yesterday as well from Emmanuel. Now, the IOC has been criticized. We've heard about this morning as well as yesterday. It is trying to make strides. It has made some strides. Some issues obviously contested with the Agenda 2020, but it's at least moving in the right direction if we compare, for example, with FIFA. So taking essentially the concept of governance, which I see as more than just leadership, more than just management, it's a much broader systemic concept. To look at it in terms of the Olympic Games, I decided to use a two-prong approach. One, to look at the systems, which are essentially the systems and structures, which are the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, the how, so the mechanisms, the coordination mechanisms that are there, but also the institutional and procedural dimensions, so the rights, the rules behind the system, the actions of people, the political background. So taking these two pieces and then combining them with the Olympic system, which Jean-Loup talked about yesterday, so I won't go into details. But we have so many different actors, NOCs, OCOGs, athletes, parents, entourage, fans, pro sports, the IFs, the World Anti-Doping Agency, the CAS, the media, the sponsors, the governments. So how does this whole system actually work? And then how does it work for a specific event? One of the issues is actually that when you put the network together, a lot of the governance concepts can start to break down. So if we talk about accountability, there's a blurring of the lines of accountability. Who are we accountable to? So if you have multiple actors in a network, are you accountable to yourself, to the different actors, to people outside the network? Same thing for performance. What do we mean by performance? Is it performance of the organization? Is it performance of the network? In the case of an event, is it just performance of the event? And therefore, your own performance is determined by how successful the event is. So for example, when you work in Olympic Games, you may be a star in terms of an employee. If the Olympic Games, if you work for 1996 in Atlanta, your performance may not be seen as well than if you work for London or Vancouver, which are seen as excellent games, and therefore your performance is seen much better, just regardless of how you performed internally. So taking all this into consideration, there you go. I looked at Calgary and then into Vancouver, but to do that, I scanned over 3,000 different pages of documents, final reports, bid reports, anything that was available in terms of archives as well that I had. And obviously working with Vancouver, I had access to additional documents, but the documents that I had were actually comparable between the two games. And I did two types of analyses. So I looked first at the network analysis. The network analysis, as Jean-Louis mentioned yesterday, allows us to look at the whole system and at different levels. So I looked at the ego level, the actor level, individual actors or stakeholders in the network in terms of their power, ability to control information, and then moved up to a triad level, so 3 actors together. How strong or weak are the ties? What kind of ties do we have? And then a whole network analysis as well to look at the structures and processes that are at play in the network in terms of coordination. And then a second analysis, which was done, content analysis, basic stuff, just to look more specifically at the coordination mechanisms, comparing between the two games, and then being able to then say, well, what is this infamous governance model for Canada? So, thanks to the UCNet program, it's complex algorithms that I don't half understand myself, but luckily there are much smarter people than me that built this system. It allows me actually to, when I looked at all the documents and looked at all the different links that are between actors, identifying them as I read through the 3,000 pages. Yes, it was a slightly long process. So this gives you an idea of the Calgary 1988 network. Obviously, this is relative. The network is always based on the data that you collect. There is no network analysis is limited in the sense that it's researcher defined. So there is no set boundary. It's built based on the data that you input. And so I had comparable documents, and so it allows me to relatively compare the two. I just would put a star beside these networks to say these are not absolute networks. So you have Calgary 1988. One of the key things is obviously and logically the OCOG was the most central, most important, most powerful, most involved, meaning it had the most links with other actors, and it controlled the information flow the most. Okay. Second, we had the IOC and the municipal government. So again, the IOC was seen as being highly involved, high number of links, able to control the flow of information between actors, so being positioned between actors where they were a broker for information, and powerful, generally speaking. Same thing for the municipal government. They were highly involved, important and powerful, but less so in terms of information flow. One of the issues with Calgary was the conflict between the municipal government, the mayor's office, and the OCOG, which was resolved, and we'll see with mechanisms later on how that was done. But still, the municipal government was highly important. So you contrast this with Vancouver. Slightly more numbers of actors, more than 3 times the number of actors in Calgary. So just by this image, you can see that games in 2010 versus 1988 are more complex to organize. And still the OCOG has to do this job. And still the OCOG is the most important, most powerful, unsurprisingly controls the information the most, and is generally the more important. Now here's the change. Now, in the second place is the federal government. So if we think about the different files that are now important in games, security, health, visas, immigration, Makes sense. The federal government becomes highly important. But not only important, but they are highly involved in the network, and they also control a lot of the information. So security is a perfect example, because even a lot of people in the OCOG will not know the security details for security reasons. Okay. Third, again, is the municipal government. So the government itself is also highly involved in controlling information and information flow itself in importance. Both, I'm talking both about the Whistler and Vancouver. Although I treated them separately, they pretty much came very closely together every time. What's different this time is that the IOC is not in the top 3. Well, so generally speaking, when I looked at the different analyses, and I won't go, you can look at the paper with all the numbers, what was interesting is that generally speaking, they're actually highly effective and efficient networks. And I can say this because, one, they had low transitivity. So this is a measure of triads, which it's like a friend of a friend is a friend. So the more friends I have that are friends of other friends, the stronger the links between us, the stronger the ties, but the more redundant information can be. So conversely, if we have low transitivity, so few friends of friends are friends, we have weaker ties, but more opportunities for new information, for strategic maneuvering, planning. And so in a network context, in what we're trying to do in terms of an event, this is a good thing because you can get new resources, new information that you don't already have because your friend of a friend is already your friend. Okay. The second one is the small numbers of actors in the core. So I did a core periphery analysis, which essentially tells me who talks to whom between groups. And so the core talks to themselves as well as everybody else, or most everybody else, and peripheral actors talk to the core, but really not many other people. So they're involved, they have specific roles to play, but they are not central as much. Interestingly enough, only 4% for Calgary and about 7-point-something% for Vancouver were core actors. So there's very few actors that are highly, highly involved, daily information, daily meetings, communicating with almost everybody in the network. So this is a good thing because you have a small core group that is much easier to manage than if you had a high number of stakeholders in the core. And I'll contrast this with a master's student of mine who did the same kind of study but with domestic games and found that there's almost more than half of the stakeholders in domestic games are considered core stakeholders. So you actually have more stakeholders in the core that you manage than you do at the Olympic Games, which is actually quite interesting in itself. Yeah. And the third one is low density. So that means there's few ties, redundant ties. So there's a lot of brokering of information, and again, that's an opportunity aspect. So, and finally, the other piece of this puzzle for the network is that the OCOG and the governments are now the central actors, generally in terms of their measures of importance, of power, of degree of involvement, number of linkages. They are definitely now the central actors that cannot be disregarded for future games. So, when I did a content analysis, I was looking at the structures and processes, specifically looking at how Calgary created its governance structures and processes, and then also doing the same thing for Vancouver and then comparing the two. Interestingly enough, all except for one mechanism, they were all the same. So first of all, in terms of structure, there's a continuity between the bid and the organizing committee in terms of leadership, in terms of the ideas. So CODA, Calgary into the OCOG, Vancouver in terms of the bid committee, into the organizing committee, we have actors that continue. And these actors, the second point is that they have specific skills together as a group of leadership that are very strong in terms of skills of sport, business, and events. And they also have a network, political network, sport network, and event network that allows them to go and get resources and talk to people. They have formal partnership agreements. The difference between Calgary and Vancouver is that Calgary created a lot of those formal partnerships only once they were planning the games. They created over 200 different formal agreements with partners, but during the planning process. Vancouver started during the bid, created the multi-party agreement, the MPA, which has become a best practice in terms of candidate cities in the IOC, highly suggested you do an MPA before you bid for the games. And so this MPA laid out formally the relationship between the key partners, which were the governments, the 4 host First Nations, the Canadian Olympic Committee, Canadian Paralympic Committee, and the bid, which would become the organizing committee. So they started even earlier, and that laid out and avoided a lot of the conflict. And this is something that when I was doing interviews, the study is part of a broader study where I did interviews and observations with Vancouver, and this was repeatedly mentioned. We always went back to the MPA about issues, who is supposed to do what, when, where, and how do you resolve conflicts. The next one is flexible organizing structures. So anybody who's worked for games knows that the only constant in games is change. So you have to be available, ready to have anything change. You come into a job, you think your job description is one thing, a week later it's something completely different, or your boss is somebody else now. And so your structure has to be able to withstand, no, withstand is maybe not the right word, able to adapt to all these changes, and be the people that you have in the network, in the organizing committee, have to be able to take that on. Coordinating structures, multiple working groups, commissions, committees. Calgary did mainly volunteer-based and run. Vancouver was much more staff-driven in that sense. Information gathering and dissemination. Obviously, Vancouver had the OGKM, which it had to follow, but Calgary also did the same procedures informally, went to ask different games, locally, internationally, past Olympic hosts, looked at different partners. And it's not only the organizing committee I'm talking about the different partners as well. Governments did the same thing. They created their own observer programs, own knowledge management systems, if you will, to go get information and then create their own systems and then be willing to pass it on. So the tourism consortium that was created for Vancouver, for example, they created a memorandum of understanding between Vancouver Tourism, BC Tourism, Canada Tourism organizations to create the tourism consortium. And their learnings, which they talked to Torino, they talked to Salt Lake, turned around and they were ready to share to anybody, any of the tourism organizations in the world who would be host cities in the future. And as the president of the tourism Vancouver mentioned, he said this is highly unusual for our industry to share this information because we're highly protective of our knowledge because we want to be where we attract the organization that attracts the most tourists. And so by sharing the information with London and with Sochi, they had meetings with them, they are, by nature, they wanted to share. And this is something that both Calgary and Vancouver did. Partner structures, even the governments, and this is even with Calgary, had secretariats. They had a commission, a coordinating office, something that was the door to the organization for the OCOG. On the flip side, so that the OCOG wouldn't have 35 different departments asking for the same information, they were the point of communication from the organization to the OCOG. And it worked so well with Vancouver. Sport Canada, who was kind of jealous because the game secretariat was outside their department, and Sport Canada thinks that Olympic Games are their event because they are Sport Canada. And so what they've done is when the Games Secretariat dissolved after the Games, they took it and created a department within Sport Canada called the Games Secretariat, which is a permanent structure now, a secretariat structure, which is actually now on its way, actually it's already in Toronto for the 2015 Pan Am Games. And so it's a permanent structure for both knowledge and to help have some consistency between one Games to the next. That was a learning from Vancouver. And we saw that too, there are secretariats for Calgary. Now, the one difference between Calgary and Vancouver, and this is based on learnings from Sydney especially, is the idea of co-location. Having all your key partners physically in the same building. For Vancouver was level 7 in the headquarters, where you actually had representatives of each government for host First Nations and the Olympic and Paralympic committees. So Sydney had issues in terms of the Olympic Delivery Authority and the OCOG, going at it sometimes, even though they were technically in the same city. You would think you could drive down the block and talk to them, but apparently not. And so Vancouver went a step further, and one of the issues impetus as well was between Ottawa, the nation's capital, and Vancouver, there are 3 time zones. It takes 4.5 to 5.5 hours to fly there. And so just coordinating between what was going on the ground over there and in the nation's capital, they wanted people on the ground. And they went the step to say, we are actually going to be in the same building. And that actually helped quite a bit in terms of resolving a lot of conflict. So that gives you an idea of the different structures that we're going to place for Vancouver and Calgary in terms of coordination. In terms of processes, they're linked to the structures. Things like relationship building, so looking to build trust, talking to people. One of the issues, however, is high turnover, which means that you always constantly have to restart that relationship with the organization. Open communication, transparency. So Calgary was knocked at one point for not being very transparent. And so they started disseminating and meeting minutes from the board and that kind of information. And Vancouver did the same, but actually went steps further, partly because the IOC was asking for annual specific reports, but also because the partners were requesting more information, more transparency, to even see their struggles so that the public could understand what was going on. Informal discussions, so actually in both cases there were issues with the IIHF in terms of the hockey tournament. Calgary wanted to increase the number of teams, for example, and so there were informal discussions pre-decisions by the federations in this case to be able to smooth out any decisions and make the process go faster. And the same thing happened with Vancouver. Seeking information from experts, hiring consultants, targeted programming for stakeholders, so in terms of having specific programs for education for schools, as well as, in our case, the First Nations, to involve them. That was key. The test events, and probably the last piece is their focus. It wasn't a local focus in either case. Calgary had a provincial and national focus, kind of split between Alberta and Canada, and Vancouver went all the way. It was a Canada's Games. It was a national focus, and they accredited that the success of the sponsorship, domestic sponsorship, to that national focus. The previous any major games in Canada had about 20 million domestic sponsorship budgets. So when Vancouver said we're going between 50, 75 to 100 million, people thought they were nuts. And then they got $700+ million, and then it was like, wow, this is absolutely crazy. It's because of this Canadian approach. They went for the pan-Canadian iconic organizations like Hudson's Bay, Bell, Roots, or Rona, all these organizations that are highly respected in Canada. And the last piece is sustainability. So what they did in both cases is they had those legacy organizations. CODA is now Winsport. Legacies Now, which was created during the bid, is now LIFT, as well as OTP, the Own the Podium for Vancouver. And so they were bringing in stakeholders that were enduring stakeholders to fill needs or gaps for their plans that they had from the bid. So, taking all of that together, what is this infamous Canadian Olympic governance system? Number one, partnerships. A Canada-wide engagement process that is strategically planned that at the core has partnerships. Number two are the democratic principles of transparency, accountability, performance, and participation. So having, for example, the municipalities, why they are so central in the networks is that they would go to the residents, have town hall meetings, have information meetings to discuss and get feedback before they proceeded. Whistler was well known. It used a very clear business approach to the Olympic Games. There's a reason why every venue in Whistler is called Whistler something, Whistler Creekside, Whistler Sliding Center, Whistler Olympic Center. It's because they wanted every media, every person in the world to have to say the word Whistler over and over and again. And by that virtue, if you say it, when you meet someone, you're supposed to say their name 3 times and you remember the name. If you say Whistler 3 times, you will remember Whistler. They want to become the premier resort municipality in the world, and that's part of how they did it. They used the Olympic Games to get their name out there. There's no thing like the Olympic Games in terms of international media promotion. Third aspect is co-location, as I mentioned earlier, and bringing in new actors, whether that's on the podium, legacies organizations, or anything else. Second is leadership, appropriate leadership. So we've seen in other games, not only the Olympics, changes in leadership because they can't get people to follow them. They don't have credibility because they don't have the skills or the network to bring everything together. So it may not be one person, it could be a group, internal leader and external leader together, working together, but that is essential in terms of the model. And one where leadership is consistent between the bid and the organizing committee. OCOG structure, the flexibility that I talked about, but also the venue team management system. And obviously, for all of you doing Olympic Games, this is not unique. But it's putting all these pieces together that make it this Canadian model. And finally, in terms of the OCOG structure, is the volunteers. Highly important, but not only the volunteers, but having everyone on the same level, having this idea of one team. So there is a staff person in that picture on the right, and the others are volunteers, but technically you shouldn't, you should know who it is. Yeah. Knowledge, acquiring knowledge and disseminating it, and a willingness to innovate. Not only on the field of play, not only having a brand spanking new venue with the latest equipment in terms of timing or whatever it is, but management innovation as well in the back. Setting standards, health and safety standards, sustainability standards, going against traditional thinking. And for Calgary, this was the venue-based management system. So they pushed that through despite the criticisms that there were in '84 in LA. And even internally, despite criticisms of their sport directors, they pushed that through and accredit some of their success to this venue management system. So all of this together, the model does actually meet some of the good governance practices in terms of formalizing partnerships, in terms of having democratic principles, and establishing an independent OCOG. Not an entirely unique approach, and one of the interesting things actually is there's no Olympic delivery authority. That's an actual quite different than London, for example, which the other pieces, I did do a separate analysis with London before, and has a lot of the same characteristics, but it has an ODA. And this was a deliberate, planned action by John Furlong because of the issues that were found in the immediately previous games. Furlong wanted control over that file of construction, even if there are the two budgets, capital and operating budgets, still being distinct. So given that, that is obviously a piece that needs further investigation, whether or not, what is the true value of an ODA in a governance system? Is it a standard practice just because everybody does it, or do we really need it? Do we not need it? Is Canadian model actually unique in that sense, that we can do it without? Probably not. This is my assumption, and I see John also shaking or agreeing. So this is something that really needs to be looked at. And what's interesting is that the model doesn't only apply, in Canada at least, it doesn't only apply to the Olympic Games. It also applies, right now we have the Canadian Women's FIFA World Cup, as well as the Pan Am Games, which are starting in a few weeks. Both games are using, not only do they have quite a few people, the Games Gypsies coming over from Vancouver, but they're actually using the same things, the same principles. The Pan Ams had the MPA from the bid. The World Cup is using that legacy concept, pushing legacy and sustainability and having these plans pre-games that will continue on post-games. Obviously, there's always stars behind all these analyses. The network is relative. I wouldn't take the network to the bank. It's more illustrative than anything else because it's based on the data I obtained. And it's a network of inter-organizational relationships, not intra-organizational structures and processes, which would be a valid and needed study as well, but a distinct one from this one. So what do the internal structures in each key partner, for example, look like? So in summary, 5 key parts to the Canadian approach to governing Olympic Games: countrywide stakeholder engagement, leadership, structure, knowledge, and innovation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Boringly technical question. In relation to the data that you obtained,
yeah,
and mapping out the relationships between people, I mean, what kind of data was it? I mean, email is relatively easy to map in that way because you've got a receiver and you've got a sender, and you know. But doing it by content analysis of the documents, so drawing on who's referencing whom and so on and so forth, must be quite a complex
It's long.
approach.
So, for example, I read through the 700 odd pages of the final report for the Calgary Games and the 300 plus English version of the Vancouver Games, and it's literally going page by page, and every time somebody is mentioned, a stakeholder, to make sure it's in the database. And obviously I assumed, because I wouldn't go necessarily to all the other stakeholders, I assumed a bi-directional relationship. So if I'm Vancouver and I said I talked to the federal government, obviously I assume that the federal government talk to me back. Mm-hmm. There are obviously unilateral ties, and I didn't do those analyses because I assumed symmetry between the different networks or ties.
And the other aspect is that obviously, as one would expect, the OCOGs are at the core, mm-hmm. but in the sense the OCOGs were, if not the authors of reports, they were quite often they would be the targets of reports. So that centrality is built into the system, and you've said this, it's a subjective account based on the available data. And so on.
There were some of the reports that I did look at were actually like the federal government reports themselves, so of their own activities, and so they would mention obviously Vancouver, but they actually focus on their own other stakeholder relationships as well, and so that's how the network could be built. It was not just OCOG focused.
And the critical thing is that the actors themselves recognize your analysis when you present it to them?
Yeah, actually, I have a long-standing partnership with Rod Windover, who was leading the federal secretary, and he was one of the creators with David Robinson of the MPA. They're the ones that pushed it. It wasn't the OCOG that pushed it. It's actually the federal government, and so a lot of the information also comes from him and the history behind that. And they agree, and this information has been shared. Actually, even the IOC has copies of the Vancouver versus London comparison.
Well, a major feature of the Canadian model is that there is no delivery authority. And unlike in other cities and commonwealth cultures like Sydney or London, of course, some people have said in London it shouldn't have been called the Olympic Delivery Authority, but the East London Delivery Authority. But so, do you have an explanation for that? Because this delivery authority has also existed in Sochi, in Torino, in many places, and it seems to be like
I think it's an institutional kind of a norm almost now that you assumed you would have a delivery authority, and Vancouver. Yeah, Furlong is very explicit on this, that he saw the issues with Sydney in particular and then with Athens and said, we don't want that. I don't know if it was a trust issue, perhaps. This is my hypothesis. And, good enough with the village in Vancouver, you could see what happened with that. But they wanted control over the process. And so they created master planning teams that were venue-based. There were 32, I think, at one point, master planning teams with an overall master. The structures internally in Vancouver were absolutely phenomenal. But he was very specific. We want control. We want to make sure these are done on time, on budget. This was his mantra.
And was it helped also by the wish of Whistler and Richmond also maybe to be in the spotlight?
Actually, Whistler, so when the Vancouver, the organizing committee was actually going to create one master planning team for the villages and do Vancouver and Whistler together. Whistler is the one that said, nope, we are doing our things ourselves. They were very clear, even from the bid, if we get on this, these are our conditions. Here's our 2020 strategic plan. This is where the Olympic Games would fit in. This is how we will engage. So they were actually quite, I want to say maybe strong or not resistant, but they stood their ground and said, no, we will build it because we need for our residents. We know what we need, and we will do it. And good for the VANOC that they said, okay, you guys do it, and then Vancouver separately. And Whistler, actually, the village is wonderful. And yeah, people, so very, very quickly it was gone.